First question would be, how could you, the pioneers of this technology, convince the British government to fund and promote a demonstration project?
Well, in a sense, we're building on the British government's stated policy, and indeed the EU stated policy, that they wish to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And there are very clear, very strong targets, both at the EU level and for each member state. What we're saying is, yes, business people can do it. The technology exists. It is proven. It clearly costs more to take CO2 out than to leave it in, but we can try to minimise that cost. All we require is the British government and other governments to provide the right market framework to incentivise us to do it. If there was no incentive, it won't happen. But we're basically saying this is how you deliver the policy you have already set out. All the EU is committed to reducing CO2 emissions now. We're giving away a mechanism for them to achieve it, but we require the right framework.
So you believe that we here in Hungary could also follow this pattern?
Yes, I think all member states should be implementing their policies. As I said at the beginning earlier on, it's not for businesses to form a view about climate change, but governments have formed a view, all the governments, including Hungary. They have agreed at the European level that climate change is a serious problem and it must be dealt with. What we are saying in effect is, yes, and we're ready and willing to help solve the problem, but you have to recognise it won't happen if you don't incentivise people to do it, because it's cheaper to leave the CO2 in the atmosphere.
If the CO2 market gets stronger and wider,
yes,
and perhaps the Americans join in,
yes,
do you think could the avoided emission in itself fund the operation of CCS system?
You mean if the price of carbon was high enough?
Would it would be pushed lower?
Yes. Let me answer it in two parts. First of all, the long term. I am very confident that with all the work that is going on to provide a robust emissions trading system, that in the long term the carbon price will rise to a level which will sustain carbon capture. It's not a very large number, but in the long term, when the initial investments have been made, when the first of a kind risks have been taken, that is the way it will be sustained. The carbon price will be high. Whether it's 50 euros or something different, I don't know, but 50 euros is extremely inexpensive compared to the cost we all currently pay for delivering renewables. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't deliver renewables, I'm simply saying governments have a cheaper option than renewables now in carbon capture. But the second part of my answer is, clearly, I think people will understand that for the first people to build the chain, to take the risk of everything happening all in a consistent manner, that carries a slightly higher risk, and the banks will require a higher risk premium. And so what I'm saying is, in the beginning, some extra help is required. It could be via the carbon price, an underpinned carbon price or some allowances, or it could be via a specific subsidy. I don't think businesses have a strong view as to which way it should be, but clearly some extra help is required at the beginning. But the long-term position is that carbon capture and storage will be funded by the normal price of carbon, and that is significantly less than the capture price implied by renewables.
So do you think it's not just that the governments subsidize the green energy and they don't do the same with the CCS?
Well, I think I agree with that to some extent. That is not to say I don't think they should subsidise green energy. I think they should. It is clear that what we all want, a low carbon future, costs some money. What we're all interested in is achieving that outcome at the lowest possible cost. And so market mechanisms are appropriate to try and reduce the cost of achieving a low carbon future. But I think if you have a consistent carbon price, that is the best way to provide for the market to deliver. And that will deliver both renewables and carbon capture and, by the way, nuclear power, because it will say the outcome we all want, low carbon electricity, costs a bit more, but then the market will achieve the best solutions in all three of those categories: renewables, carbon capture and nuclear. They all give a different approach to the same problem.
Are the developing countries interested at all in any kind of carbon capture?
I've given talks on energy policy and on carbon capture in India and in Sri Lanka and in some other developing countries. I haven't unfortunately visited China. And I've given those talks over several years. I've noticed, encouragingly, that each time you talk to them, there is more and more interest. And although I haven't been to China, I understand that the Chinese are now extremely interested in what can be done about the climate change problem for us all. I think the spotlight of the Olympics will encourage everybody, but particularly the Chinese, to be thinking about the environment, how to improve the environment. And there is no bigger challenge than the climate change challenge. So I think my answer is yes, they are becoming extremely interested. But with a developing country, by definition, they don't have a lot of money to invest in these more expensive forms of energy production. So I think the right message is, and this is another of the strengths of the European emissions trading system, it is capable of providing an incentive for the developing countries to participate in the carbon market. And so if CDMs are available in China and India and in the developing markets, they too can benefit from a strong carbon price. And I think that is the best way to provide an incentive where people are now very interested in investing in these options.
Europe could also transport the technology.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons we want to be the first, or one of the first, is that we know that if we can successfully demonstrate the whole chain from power generation to CO2 storage, we know everybody will want to talk to us and they'll want to try and use what has been demonstrated as a successful technology. So all the partners with us have been putting a lot of effort and their own money into helping our project because they know that the rewards will be global if we are successful. It's a very commercial point.
I got a funny question for the last. You said that CO2 is invisible gas, and so how can we be sure that a company really pumps it down underground and does not emit it?
I mean, CO2 is invisible, so is natural gas. I'm absolutely certain, having read the draft CCS directive, that very strong methods of monitoring and verification are going to be a part and parcel of the new regime. So I don't think there's any real problem with ensuring that the proper calculations are made, that proper monitoring takes place. I think of the challenges, that's the one I think is the easiest to solve. That's going to happen. The professional scientists and the professional policymakers aren't going to allow anything to happen that hasn't been properly verified.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, it's a pleasure.
In my view, the governments of the world have reached a conclusion, based on overwhelming scientific evidence, that climate change is a real, serious threat, and action has to be taken to deal with it. When governments reach such conclusions, it's the job of businesses to invest and innovate, providing the policymakers have put in place a framework that steers that action. The theme for my contribution today is that the EU and the Member State governments